The Senate chamber was already restless before Cleopatra ever set foot in Rome. Whispers traveled faster than the winds, and the whispers all spoke of her. She was no ordinary queen. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a descendant of Ptolemy, and a woman unlike any Rome had ever seen. And most dangerous of all, she had captured the heart of Julius Caesar. But was this love, or was it the spark that would set the Roman Republic on fire? The story begins not in Rome, but along the banks of the Nile in 48 BCE. Egypt, once a jewel of the ancient world, was rotting under corruption and family feuds. Cleopatra, barely in her early 20s, was locked in a brutal struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, for the throne. Exiled from Alexandria, she watched as her brother's advisors stripped her of power. That was when fortune carried Caesar to Egypt. Caesar had just crushed Pompey in the Roman Civil War. Pompey, once his ally, had fled across the Mediterranean to seek safety with Ptolemy. But instead of sanctuary, he found betrayal. Assassinated on the Egyptian shore, his head presented to Caesar as a trophy. The Egyptians thought Caesar would be pleased. Instead, he wept. The killing of a Roman consul, even a rival, was too great an insult. Caesar now found himself in Alexandria, a guest and a prisoner amid Egypt's chaos. That was when Cleopatra made her move. Legend says she had herself smuggled into Caesar's palace rolled up inside a carpet, carried by a servant as if she were a gift. When the carpet was unrolled, there she was, dark-eyed, commanding, draped in silks, her very presence a storm. It was not beauty alone that disarmed Caesar, though. Cleopatra's charm lay in her wit, her intellect, her sheer audacity. To Caesar, she was more than a queen. She was a survivor, a woman unafraid to gamble everything for power. And for Cleopatra, Caesar was more than a protector. He was the sword she could wield against her enemies, the key to reclaiming Egypt's throne. Together, they formed an alliance sealed in passion. Caesar crushed Ptolemy's armies, restoring Cleopatra to power as queen. From this bond, a child was born, Caesarion. But in Rome, the whispers had already begun. To the senators of Rome, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a seductress. A foreigner, a serpent from the east, sinking her fangs into Caesar's veins. They had already feared Caesar's ambition. He was dictator for life, adored by soldiers, loved by the people, too powerful for the fragile republic to contain. But with Cleopatra by his side, the fear deepened. For what if Caesar planned more than dictatorship? What if he meant to abandon Rome's traditions and rule as a king, with Cleopatra as his queen? It was unthinkable. It was terrifying, and it was perhaps the spark that turned conspiracy into murder. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra arrived in Rome, escorted in splendor. She did not come as a supplicant, but as a sovereign ally, staying in Caesar's villa beyond the Tiber. For ordinary Romans, she was a marvel, exotic and fascinating. For the Senate, she was poison in human form. Caesar showered her with honors. A golden statue of Cleopatra stood in the temple of Venus Genetrix, Caesar's divine ancestor. She was treated not as a guest, but as Rome's equal. And rumors swirled that Caesar might recognize Caesarion as his heir. This was the breaking point. If Caesarion was heir, Rome's future would be ruled not by a Roman, but by a child of Egypt. Not by the Senate, but by the bloodline of pharaohs. To the senators, it was the death of the Republic. The tension exploded on the Ides of March, 44 BC. Caesar strode into the Senate, dismissing warnings of plots and omens. To his killers, each dagger was meant not just for Caesar the man, but for Caesar the king, and for Cleopatra, the queen they believed had ensnared him. As Caesar collapsed beneath 23 wounds, he fell not only as Rome's dictator, but as Cleopatra's shield. And in that moment, she was exposed, vulnerable, a foreign queen stranded in a hostile city. Her role in his death was never direct. She had not plotted it, nor had she lifted a blade. But her presence, her influence, was the ghost that haunted the chamber. To Rome's old guard, Caesar's ambition to unite himself with Cleopatra was the final proof. Caesar had to die. So the question remains, was Cleopatra merely Caesar's lover, or was she the silent cause of his fall? The moment Caesar's blood stained the Senate floor, everything changed for Cleopatra. The daggers that cut him down had struck at her too. Not her body, but her power, her survival, her dream of a dynasty that bound Rome and Egypt together. When word of the assassination reached her villa across the Tiber, panic surged through her court. The Queen of Egypt was now a foreign widow in a city boiling with rage. Would the mob turn on her? Would the assassins drag her name through the dirt as the corrupter of Caesar? Her enemies in Rome wasted no time. In the streets, pamphlets and whispers blamed Cleopatra. They painted her as a sorceress, a temptress who had bewitched Caesar, convincing him to wear purple like a king, to sit on a golden throne, to dream of ruling the world not as a Roman, but as a pharaoh. The fear was not entirely false. For Cleopatra had seen the future. She did not want a throne in Alexandria alone. She wanted an empire, and Caesar had been her bridge to it. His death shattered that bridge into dust. But Cleopatra was not a woman to crumble. In the days after the murder, she tread carefully. She did not appear in public, nor did she demand vengeance. She moved like a shadow, waiting to see who would rise from Caesar's ashes. Would it be Mark Antony, the fiery general who had stood at Caesar's side? Or would it be Octavian, the boy barely 19, Caesar's adopted son and heir? Antony was the first to act. In a thunderous speech, he held up Caesar's bloodied cloak before the Roman people, pointing to the rents of the daggers, each wound a crime of treason. The crowd erupted. The city rioted. Antony had transformed Caesar from a dictator into a martyr. And Cleopatra watched. She knew Antony well enough. He was bold, reckless, driven by passion. He would not resist her charms. But Octavian was something else, a pale, sickly youth with a quiet ruthlessness in his eyes. The kind of man who played the long game. She underestimated him at first. Many did. But there was something else that made Cleopatra hesitate. Caesarion. Her son, barely 3 years old, was the living proof of her bond with Caesar. To her, he was Egypt's salvation, the true heir of both Rome and the Nile. To the Senate, he was a nightmare. If Caesarion lived, Rome might one day kneel not to a Roman-born leader, but to a half-Egyptian child. Antony dismissed the boy as a threat. Octavian, however, saw him clearly for what he was, competition. Only one son of Caesar could rule Rome. Either Caesarion or Octavian had to be erased. And so Cleopatra faced a cruel truth. The legacy she had dreamed of, Caesarion seated on a throne stretching from Rome to Alexandria, was now the very reason her enemies sharpened their knives. Cleopatra left Rome quietly, returning to Egypt with Caesarion. But she did not slink away in defeat. She returned with her head held high, with ships, soldiers, and silver. Egypt was hers again, and though Caesar was gone, she knew she could find another champion. That champion would come soon enough. For in the years that followed, Antony and Octavian locked horns. The liberators, Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's murderers, were crushed at Philippi, but unity between Antony and Octavian collapsed. Rome had split into two camps, two masters clawing at each other. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, and Cleopatra, waiting in Alexandria, saw her chance. When Antony summoned her to answer questions of loyalty, she sailed to him not in fear, but in splendor. Her barge glided along the river like a floating palace, purple sails billowing, silver oars flashing. Cleopatra herself reclined in robes of gold, presented as the living goddess Isis. Antony was undone. As Caesar once had, he fell under her spell. And once more, Cleopatra bound herself to Rome's greatest general, her survival entwined with his ambition. But Rome never forgot. In the taverns, in the Senate, in Octavian's speeches, Cleopatra's name grew darker, more poisonous. She was not merely a queen anymore. She was a curse. a foreign temptress who had destroyed Caesar, who now corrupted Antony, dragging him into her web. And the memory of Caesar's fall hung over it all. Whispers returned. Had Cleopatra pushed Caesar too far, made him reach too high, dream of kingship, empire, godhood? Did her presence convince him to crown Caesar Ion, and in doing so seal his doom? It was a question that would not die. For some, Caesar fell because of his arrogance. For others, because of the Senate's envy. But for many, the true seed of his death had been planted the night Cleopatra rolled herself into a carpet and walked into his life. And now, with Antony at her side, Cleopatra was no longer just blamed for Caesar's death. She was about to plunge all of Rome into its bloodiest war. The memory of Caesar's death still haunted Rome when Cleopatra's name returned like a storm. Years had passed since the daggers of the Ides of March. Yet to many Romans, it was as if the Egyptian queen had never left the stage. She was still painted as the serpent of the Nile, the woman who had bewitched Caesar and pulled him toward monarchy, the shadow behind his downfall. Now she stood beside another Roman, Mark Antony, and the whispers grew louder. Had Cleopatra destroyed one Roman hero only to ensnare another? Antony had been Caesar's loyal lieutenant, a man of fire and charisma. But once he bound himself to Cleopatra, the Roman Senate began to see him not as a general, but as a puppet. The Queen of Egypt supplied him with gold, armies, and ships. Together they lived not as allies, but as rulers, draped in luxury, hosting feasts where they styled themselves as Dionysus and Isis, gods upon the earth. To Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, this was more than scandal. It was strategy. He began to weave a tale for Rome, that Antony no longer served the Republic, no longer served Caesar's legacy, but had fallen to the wiles of a foreign queen. Cleopatra, Octavian said, was the same woman who had lured Caesar into dreams of kingship, the same queen whose son, Caesar Ion, threatened to steal Rome's destiny. It was not Antony Rome had to fear, it was Cleopatra. The echoes of Caesar's downfall now became weapons in Octavian's hands. He reminded the Senate of Caesar's golden statue of Cleopatra, of the honors he had heaped upon her, of his scandalous public appearances with her. He whispered that Caesar had meant to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, to make Cleopatra queen of Rome itself. Was it true? Perhaps not. But truth mattered little. Memory mattered. Fear mattered. The Senate remembered why Caesar had been struck down, not just for his power, but for the suspicion that he would make himself king and Cleopatra queen. Octavian fanned the embers until they burned into war. The world-shaking conflict came in 31 BCE at Actium. Antony and Cleopatra's fleets faced Octavian's. On the waters of Greece, the fate of Rome was decided. The battle was chaos, oars splintering, ships burning, men drowning in waves turned red with blood. And then, at the height of the fight, Cleopatra's ships broke formation. Whether by fear, by strategy, or by betrayal, she fled with her fleet. Antony, torn between duty and love, abandoned his men to follow her. Octavian seized victory. Back in Rome, he declared the war was not against Antony, but against Cleopatra, against the foreign queen who had once destroyed Caesar and now had nearly destroyed the Republic itself. His propaganda was relentless. Cleopatra was Rome's true enemy, the corrupter of heroes, the poison in Caesar's veins, the downfall of Antony. And with Antony and Cleopatra's suicides in Alexandria the following year, Octavian stood alone as master of Rome. He took the title Augustus, the first emperor, and the Republic was no more. Yet through it all, the shadow of Cleopatra lingered. Was she truly the reason Caesar had fallen? Some said yes, that she made him reckless, arrogant, too eager to reach for the crown. That her presence in Rome, her golden statue, her child Caesar Ion, forced the conspirators' hands. Without her, Caesar might have lived. Others said no. Caesar's ambition was his own. He needed no queen to hunger for power. Cleopatra was simply caught in the storm of Rome's politics, a scapegoat for men who could not accept Caesar's greatness. But the truth may lie somewhere in between. For Cleopatra was more than a lover, more than a queen. She was an equal. She gave Caesar not just passion but vision of a dynasty that joined Rome and Egypt, that ruled not as a republic but as an empire. Perhaps that dream was too dangerous for the old guard of Rome to bear. And so Caesar died, the republic fell, and Cleopatra's name was forever entwined with his fate. Was she the love that lifted him, or the serpent that doomed him? That question still coils around history like smoke, unanswered, eternal. Story finished.